There is a moment in 1716 where the entire Caribbean balance of power shifts, and almost nobody notices it happening in real time. A small island in the Bahamas, barely a fly speck on imperial maps, becomes home to roughly 1,000 men and women who have decided, collectively, that the rules of civilization no longer apply to them. They fly no flag with loyalty. They answer to no crown. They have built, in the span of a few chaotic years, something that no maritime empire expected and no military force could immediately suppress. Not a pirate hideout, not a smuggler's den, a functioning republic, brutal and democratic in equal measure, operating on principles that the great powers of Europe would not formally articulate for another 60 years. The place was Nassau, and what happened there between 1706 and 1718 is one of the most radical political experiments in modern history, dressed up in the language of criminality so that serious people would never have to take it seriously. I want to take it seriously. Because when you strip away the romanticism and the treasure maps and the Hollywood mythology, what you find underneath is something stranger and more significant than the legend. You find a community of people, most of them poor, most of them previously conscripted or indentured or enslaved by the very empires they were now robbing, who figured out how to govern themselves without a king, and who paid for that experiment with their lives when the empires decided the lesson could not be allowed to spread. To understand Nassau, you have to understand what the world looked like to the men who built it. The War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713. It had consumed Europe for 12 years, and it had consumed the Caribbean for the same 12 years in a parallel conflict fought at sea, where English privateers operated under royal letters of marque that gave them legal permission to attack Spanish and French shipping. These were not pirates technically. They were contractors, sanctioned violence on behalf of crown and profit, paid in a share of whatever they captured. Then the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed. And somewhere between the treaty tables in Europe and the actual sea lanes of the Atlantic, 30,000 privateer sailors found themselves suddenly unemployed, and more importantly, suddenly illegal. The same men who had been attacking Spanish ships with royal approval last year were now, this year, criminals if they continued doing exactly what they had been trained, equipped, and encouraged to do. The British Navy demobilized. The pay stopped. The letters of marque expired, and the ships were still out there, crewed by men with nowhere to go and no legal means of survival. Men who had spent a decade learning that violence at sea was profitable, and who now found that the line between privateer and pirate was simply a piece of paper that someone in London had decided to stop printing. Many of them went to Nassau. The island of New Providence, where Nassau sat, had been devastated by Spanish and French raids in 1703 and 1706. The English colonial government had effectively collapsed. There was a fort, mostly rubble. There was a harbor, one of the best natural anchorages in the Caribbean, deep enough for large ships, shallow enough at the approaches to prevent naval vessels of the line from pursuing you inside. And there was nothing else. No governor, no garrison, no law. It was, in other words, a blank canvas. The men who came to Nassau in the years following the war's end weren't arriving with a political philosophy. They were arriving with a problem, which was that they needed to eat, they needed to repair their ships, they needed somewhere safe to offload captured cargo, and they needed to do all of this without getting hanged. Nassau solved all of those problems simultaneously. But something happened in Nassau beyond simple refuge. Something that the historical record captures in fragments and that you have to read carefully to see. The men who came to Nassau started making decisions together. Pirate ships in this period operated under articles, written agreements signed by every crew member before a voyage, specifying how decisions would be made, how disputes would be resolved, how captured cargo would be divided, and what punishments applied to violations. These weren't informal customs. They were contracts, detailed, specific, legally precise in their own way, and remarkable in one particular aspect. They were democratic. the captain of a pirate ship in Nassau's golden age was elected. He could be removed by majority vote. His authority during combat was absolute, but outside combat, he was essentially first among equals. The quartermaster, elected separately, served as a check on the captain's power, controlling the distribution of goods and managing disputes. Major decisions, whether to attack a particular target, whether to accept a proposed division of spoils, whether to change course, were put to a vote of the full crew. This was not how any legitimate institution in 1715 operated. The British Navy ran on absolute hierarchy and brutal discipline. Merchant ships gave captains unchecked authority over crews who had no recourse and no rights. The political systems of England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, all were organized around the principle that authority descended from above, from God to king to aristocrat to merchant to everyone else. In Nassau, authority ascended from below, and the men who built that system weren't philosophers. They were sailors who had spent their lives at the bottom of hierarchies that exploited them, and who had worked out, practically and empirically, that a different arrangement was possible. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the founding figures of what historians would eventually call the Flying Gang, the loose confederation of captains who made Nassau their base from roughly 1713 onward. Hornigold was English, a former privateer, and by all accounts a genuinely talented sailor and commander. He was also, in the early years, something of an idealist in the specific and limited way that idealism expresses itself in men who have survived hard conditions. Hornigold's crew in the early Nassau years operated under a peculiar restriction. He refused to attack English ships, French ships, Spanish ships, Dutch ships. These were acceptable targets. English ships were not. This wasn't law. Nassau had no law. It was a principle held and enforced collectively that carried with it the vestigial loyalty of men who had served the English crown and hadn't quite finished grieving the relationship. That principle would not survive contact with the full Nassau community, because Nassau attracted men from everywhere. English sailors certainly, but also French and Dutch and Portuguese, men who had served in navies and merchant fleets across the Atlantic world, men who had been enslaved and escaped, men who had been transported to the colonies as indentured labor and completed their terms to find themselves free but penniless in a world that had no use for them, and men who had been born free in the Caribbean, in communities the colonial powers acknowledged only when they wanted something from them. These men did not share Hornigold's English loyalties, and in the democracy of Nassau, their votes counted equally. The Flying Gang grew. Through 1714 and 1715 and 1716, Nassau's population expanded and consolidated, absorbing arriving crews, integrating new ships, becoming something more organized and more formidable than a simple haven for outcasts. At its peak, Nassau's pirate community could put somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 armed men on ships simultaneously. No single colonial governor in the Caribbean commanded that much force. The combined naval presence of England in the region during the years when London was focused on European affairs and hadn't yet recognized the scale of what was developing in the Bahamas was barely larger. Nassau was, for a window of approximately 5 years, a genuine naval power. The operations that launched from Nassau in this period were not the random opportunism of desperate men. They were coordinated, systematic, and increasingly sophisticated. Ships worked in concert. Information about convoy routes and cargo manifests circulated through the Nassau community. Captains who had competed as privateers now collaborated as something closer to a navy without a state, attacking targets they had collectively identified and dividing the proceeds according to articles they had collectively agreed. The cargo flowing back into Nassau was extraordinary. In 1716 alone, Nassau-based pirates captured goods worth an estimated several £100,000 sterling in contemporary value. Sugar, tobacco, manufactured goods, silver from Spanish shipments, and enslaved people being transported to colonial plantations, who were sometimes freed and sometimes, in the moral complexity that the pirate republic never fully resolved, absorbed into crews as paid workers or sold as property again depending on the captain and the circumstances. That ambiguity about slavery is one of the most contested aspects of Nassau's history and one of the most important. The Pirate Republic was not an abolitionist movement. It did not arrive at a principled rejection of slavery as an institution. What it arrived at, in practice, was something messier and more interesting. Black sailors served in Nassau crews in numbers completely unlike anything in legitimate maritime employment. Freed slaves served as full members with full voting rights and full shares of captured cargo on many Nassau ships. Escaped slaves arrived in Nassau and were integrated into the community without being returned to their owners, not out of ideology, but out of the same practical logic that governed everything else in Nassau. You were useful, you signed the articles, you got a vote and a share. This was radical by the standards of 1716. It was not radical enough by the standards of history. And the tension between what Nassau actually was and what it might have become runs underneath the whole story. Edward Teach arrived in Nassau sometime around 1716. He came under the wing of Benjamin Hornigold, who recognized talent and gave him command of a captured sloop. Within a year, Teach had accumulated a small fleet and a reputation that exceeded anything the evidence of his actual crimes fully supports. He was operating as Blackbeard by 1717, and the mythology was already overtaking the man. What's less understood about Blackbeard is the degree to which he was a product of Nassau's specific political culture, rather than simply a personality who happened to end up there. The theatrical ferocity, the burning fuses in the hair, the elaborate performance of menace, these weren't the expressions of a sadist. They were calculated tools of a man who understood that terror, credibly deployed, reduced the need for actual violence. Blackbeard, by the historical record, killed remarkably few people. He captured dozens of ships with minimal bloodshed because his reputation preceded him so effectively that most merchant captains concluded resistance was irrational before he'd fired a shot. He was, in a specific sense, a pirate intellectual, a man who had thought carefully about the economics of violence and arrived at a strategy that maximized profit while minimizing the moral cost. Whether that calculation troubled him is something the historical record doesn't tell us. What the record does tell us is that Blackbeard operated with a degree of coordination with Nassau's broader community that makes simple piracy an inadequate description. He corresponded with other captains. He participated in the informal governance structures of Nassau. He was, for a period, part of something larger than himself. The same was true of Charles Vane, one of the most aggressive of the Nassau captains and one of the most politically committed to Nassau's independence. Where Hornigold retained an English loyalty and Blackbeard maintained a pragmatic flexibility, Vane was something closer to a true believer in Nassau as an institution. When the British eventually sent a governor to the Bahamas with an offer of pardon, Vane was among the most vociferous opponents of acceptance. Not because he feared the hangman, though he should have, because he understood that accepting the pardon meant accepting the legitimacy of the power offering it, and that this concession would unravel everything Nassau had built. He was right, and he lost the argument anyway. Anne Bonny and Mary Red arrived in Nassau's orbit during this same period, and their presence in the historical record is worth dwelling on because it complicates the already complicated picture of who Nassau actually was. Bonny left her husband for John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, and joined his crew. Reed arrived disguised as a man, was discovered to be a woman, and remained with the crew on equal terms. Both women fought alongside male crew members and were described in contemporary accounts as more ferocious in combat than most of the men aboard. The fact that women could occupy this role in Nassau's world, fighting, voting, earning shares, existing as functional equals in a context where their entire social world had defined them as property, is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of Nassau's foundational principle. You signed the Articles, you got a vote. The Articles, so far as we know, did not specify gender. The democracy of Nassau was imperfect and often brutal, but it was, by the standards of 1716, shockingly inclusive. Neither Bonnie nor Red was exceptional within Nassau's community. They were expressions of it. The economics of Nassau are worth dwelling on because they're almost never discussed in the accounts that prefer to focus on cannon fire and treasure chests. Nassau ran on a redistributive economy. Captured cargo came in and was divided according to the Articles. Captains received 2 portions to a common sailor's 1. The quartermaster received a share and a half. Specialists, the carpenter and surgeon whose skills kept ships operational and crews alive, received additional compensation. And men injured in combat received payment from a common fund before the general division. A set amount for a lost arm, for a lost leg, for an eye. It was, recognizably, a form of workers' compensation, operating in a community that had no government to mandate it. Compare this to legitimate maritime employment of the same period. Merchant sailors were paid at the captain's discretion, received nothing for injuries, and had no legal recourse when wages were withheld. Naval sailors were subject to flogging, could be pressed into service against their will, and had essentially no rights that any officer was obligated to respect. The men who came to Nassau were not abandoning reasonable employment for a life of crime. They were abandoning legalized exploitation for something closer to fair terms, at the cost of being hunted by every navy in the Atlantic. That is the actual Nassau bargain, and it explains the numbers. 1,000 men don't choose a life where capture means hanging unless the alternative is a life where survival means something they've decided is worse. The Board of Trade reports from this period show an escalating alarm about Nassau that goes beyond simple concern about stolen cargo. The language of the reports is interesting because it keeps reaching for the right word and not quite finding it. Nassau is described as a nest of pirates, which is accurate but insufficient. As a threat to commerce, which is true but understated. As a dangerous example, which is closer to the actual concern. The dangerous example problem was this: Nassau demonstrated that a community of poor people could organize themselves without a king, sustain themselves through collective action, and successfully resist the most powerful naval forces in the world for years. This was information that the ruling class of Europe did not want widely distributed. Not because they believed the pirates were philosophers, because they could see in the economic disruption Nassau was causing and the manpower it was attracting from legitimate employment, the outlines of a contagion. King George I issued the Act of Grace in 1717, offering full pardon to any pirate who surrendered by September 5th of that year. It was a calculated political move designed to fracture the Nassau community by offering its members an exit ramp, separating those who could be reintegrated into legitimate society from those who would refuse and could therefore be hunted without the political complication of pardoning everyone around them. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a Royal Navy escort, the authority of a commission as governor of the Bahamas, and a very clear mandate: end the Republic. The community fractured exactly as London had calculated it would. Hornigold accepted the pardon and became, in one of history's more dramatic reversals, a pirate hunter working for the crown he had spent years robbing. His knowledge of Nassau's operations, its networks, its captains and their habits made him devastatingly effective in this new role. He died in a shipwreck in 1719 before the full implications of his choice had time to fully unfold. Vane refused the pardon, fired a cannon at Rogers' fleet as he left Nassau Harbor, and spent the next 2 years as a hunted man. He was captured in 1720, tried in Jamaica, and hanged. Rackham accepted the pardon briefly, then returned to piracy, was captured in 1720, and was hanged in Jamaica. Bonnie and Red were captured with him. Red died in prison, cause uncertain, before sentence could be carried out. Bonnie's fate after her trial is genuinely unknown. The record simply stops. Blackbeard was dead by November 1718, killed in a confrontation with Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy off the coast of North Carolina. The account of his death is so theatrical that it reads like something his own reputation generated. He took 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds before going down. Whether this is accurate or embellishment is impossible to determine at this distance. What is certain is that he was hunted specifically, that the operation to kill him was ordered from London, and that the speed with which it was executed suggests the British government considered him not merely a criminal, but a symbol that needed to be destroyed before it could be martyred. By 1720, Nassau was over. The harbor that had sheltered 1,000 pirates was under British administration. The captains were dead or pardoned and converted into instruments of their former enemies. The articles that had governed the Republic were dissolved. The democracy of Nassau, which had operated continuously for approximately 6 years and had functioned as the most radical experiment in collective self-governance that the Atlantic world had yet seen, was dismantled so efficiently that most of the people living through it probably didn't fully register what had been lost. What had been lost was a proof of concept. The men and women of Nassau had demonstrated empirically that you did not need a king to organize collective action, that hierarchy was not the only available architecture for human cooperation, that people at the bottom of every legitimate social structure could build something functional and durable and, for a period, militarily formidable, without the permission of anyone above them. They had also demonstrated the limits of what you could build without ideology. Nassau had no theory of itself. It had practices, articles, customs, a functional culture of rough equality, but it had no articulated vision of what it was trying to become, no framework for extending its principles beyond the immediate community of those who had signed the articles. When the Empire offered individual pardons, there was no political language within Nassau for refusing collectively, no shared understanding of what they were defending that was strong enough to hold against the offer of personal safety. The French and American revolutions, which would articulate precisely that kind of political language 60 years later, owed nothing directly to Nassau. The intellectual genealogy doesn't connect cleanly. But the problem Nassau failed to solve, how do you sustain collective self-governance against the organized violence of existing power, was exactly the problem the revolutionaries of the late 18th century were trying to solve. They had the advantage of philosophy departments and printing presses and decades of accumulated political theory. Nassau had articles and a good harbor, and approximately 5 years before the empires noticed, it was serious. There is one more thing the historical record preserves from Nassau's final years, and it's small enough that it gets omitted from most accounts. When Woodes Rogers arrived in 1718 to dissolve the Republic, he found something unexpected in Nassau. He found the harbor defended. Vane's fleet was there, armed and hostile. The community had debated collectively whether to resist. Some had voted for acceptance, some had voted for resistance. The debate itself, the fact that a community of outlaws organized a political process to decide whether to fight or surrender to a naval governor backed by the British Crown, is the most Nassau thing that Nassau ever did. They voted, they disagreed. The Republic held its last democratic proceeding, and then, as democracies sometimes do, chose the path that ended it. Vane fired his cannon and sailed out of the harbor and into the rest of his short life. The others watched him go and made their individual calculations. The Republic dissolved not with a battle, but with a decision made by the people who had built it, that the cost of maintaining it had exceeded what they were individually willing to pay. The harbor is still there. The approaches are still shallow. The fort that Rogers rebuilt on the ruins of the original is still standing, though it serves different purposes now. Nassau is a city a capital, a tourist destination. The ships that come in now are cruise liners and yachts, and the occasional naval vessel on courtesy visits. But if you read the accounts, if you sit with the articles and the depositions and the Board of Trade reports and the trial transcripts, something comes through that the official history has always worked very hard to keep submerged. The men and women of Nassau were not simply criminals. They were people who looked at the world as it was arranged and decided to arrange it differently, and who succeeded at that project long enough to matter, long enough to frighten the most powerful governments on Earth, long enough that those governments felt they had no choice but to send a warship to end it. That's not a pirate story. That's a political story. It just wore a pirate story as a disguise. And the disguise worked perfectly. It still does. We tell the story of Nassau as adventure, as romance, as the golden age of piracy. And in doing so, we drain it of exactly the meaning that made it dangerous when it was real. The Republic lasted 6 years. The forgetting has lasted 300.